Up next is our main event, Dr. Michael Best. Dr. Best is a clinical psychologist who works as a professor at the University of Toronto. Dr. Best leads the TIP Research Lab in Toronto, which specializes in research on the topic of psychosis. Personally, I find his name well fitted because he is probably the best psychologist in the country at treating psychosis with CBT. Please help me in giving a very warm welcome to Dr. Michael Best.
I am very excited to have been invited here. And thank you, Jonathan, for organizing this and working around my schedule. Unfortunately, I think I'm not the easiest person to organize calendars with, and that is definitely one of my personal flaws, I think. So thank you for your flexibility and making this work. I really appreciate that. I started at the University of Toronto in 2019 or so, and I think it was really soon after that I got connected with Home on the Hill. And so it was really nice to get connected with this organization, and I've been so impressed at everything that Home on the Hill is trying to do and everyone affiliated with Home on the Hill. And thank you to everyone for the support, because I know Home on the Hill has promoted our research studies and got research participants for us. And one of the things that we're really trying to do through our research is make these treatments more accessible for people. And one of the ways that we can do that at no cost is through research studies. So it's about the only way I have to make that available at no cost. And I try as much as possible to do it in a reasonable amount of time. So at the university, that's the main thing that I do. I run a psychology clinic where we offer these treatments as well in private practice. And I actually do a lot of training of clinicians across the province and the country in CBT for psychosis, CBT for bipolar disorder, and cognitive remediation. So I'm hoping to give you a bit of an overview of what these treatments look like and the evidence base for it. I will say, I'm really big on evidence, and that everything we do from a treatment perspective should be evidence-based. There's a lot of people out there doing things that are not based on evidence and are based, on anecdotes or opinion. I'm a big believer that if there's not evidence to support it, then we need to get that evidence before we're trying to offer this on a large scale. So everything I'm going to talk about today is to tell you about the evidence for these two treatments, cognitive remediation and cognitive behavioral therapy. Really, I'm going to focus on psychosis. A lot of what I will talk about will also be applicable to bipolar disorder. I'm not going to focus on bipolar disorder as much, but if you're interested in that, please, come talk to me afterwards. I'm happy to give you an overview of bipolar disorder as well. Typically, we think of psychosis. When we think of psychosis, we think of things like hallucinations, delusions, really not pleasant terms. Those are very medicalized terms, I would say. I prefer to use these terms, unshared experiences and unusual beliefs, because a lot of times for people who have experienced psychosis, it's not that it's a delusion per se, whatever that actually means, but it's a belief that maybe is not as socially acceptable as another type of belief, maybe taken out of context, isn't as easy to understand for people in that person's life. And it's not the belief most of the time that's the problem. It's how that belief is interacting with the person's environmental context and influencing how they can actually interact with the world. Disorganized thinking can come up when we think about psychosis. And two of the features of psychosis that we don't often think about are what's called negative symptoms. The most common form of negative symptom would be difficulty with motivation. And a lot of folks who have psychosis really have a hard time with that motivational aspect and being motivated to actually do some of those activities of daily living, work, school, engage in social interactions. And cognitive impairment. So cognitive difficulties in areas like attention, memory, problem-solving ability. Psychosis can really impact that for people, which makes the recovery process much more challenging. Treatment typically for psychosis has focused on the hallucinations, delusions from a medicalized context. And primarily, I'm sure everyone's familiar with this, it's medication. So, you go into any sort of medical environment, what you're going to be prescribed is an antipsychotic medication if you've got psychosis. And antipsychotic medications work for a lot of people. They were really a game changer in a lot of ways when they first came on the market. They gave people the opportunity to get back to life and gave people a chance to live symptom-free for at least periods of time. Big difference between that and prior to medications. The problem with medications is that a lot of people actually choose not to take medications for a variety of reasons. And this is the largest clinical trial out there on the efficacy of antipsychotic medication for people with psychosis. This was published in the biggest medical journal really out there, the New England Journal of Medicine. The headline finding from this study was that 75% of people discontinued their medication within the study period, which was 18 months. So 3/4 of people are discontinuing their medication before it would have been recommended by their doctor, well before even the end of this relatively brief 18-month study period. So even if medications work, they're not terribly helpful if people don't want to take them for whatever reason that is. And one of the biggest reasons people tend to not want to take antipsychotic medications, side effects are a big one, but negative treatment experiences actually tend to be even bigger than that. So the experience of, being brought into hospital, kept there potentially against your will, given a medication, told that you have to take this medication before you can be discharged. Maybe being discharged and put on a community treatment order and still, kind of being forced to take that medication. That takes a lot of that empowerment and personal independence away from people. It's not a pleasant experience, even if the medication is really helpful. And so those types of treatment experiences can play into whether or not someone wants to stay on the medication or not. And side effects, I'm sure everyone's familiar with side effects. They can be very unpleasant. And it's often a big balance between managing the side effects and dealing with the psychosis if it comes up. So antipsychotic medication is helpful, but it's probably not enough. And it would be nice if we had other approaches that could help people in addition to antipsychotic medication, or potentially even instead of antipsychotic medication if somebody's not ready to start taking the medication, or for any variety of reasons, may never want to take medication. I'm going to show you some evidence, and I'm going to walk you through the different techniques and things that we might work with people on that can actually be helpful in addition to medication. The other big issue with medication we typically find is medication is really focused on one domain of recovery. So it's really focused on symptoms and making those symptoms go away, which is certainly very helpful. And I will say up front, sometimes when I talk about this, I come across as being slightly anti-medication. That is not the case at all. I know a lot of people, both personally and professionally, who have benefited hugely from antipsychotic meds. The one issue with it is if you can make those symptoms go away, so say we can make the voices disappear, say we can make those distressing beliefs, they're not true, I don't believe those anymore, whether or not that's the goal or not, say we can make that happen. Still leaves the person at a place where now you have to independently get your life back on track. And you've got to independently, get back to school, build up those social relationships that were maybe affected during the episode of psychosis, think about work, get all of these areas of your life back in order, get yourself feeling good again, get that self-esteem built back up, get that hope for the future built back up. That ends up being left on you. Medication doesn't help with any of that piece. And so one of the things that I've been really working on and pushing, at least in the academic field so far, is trying to think about recovery from psychosis as being a combination of these three domains. So not just being focused only on symptoms, but also being focused on that functional recovery so people can get back to the life that you want to be living, and that personal recovery, which is really focused on how you feel about yourself, how you feel about your future, how connected you feel to your community and the context around you. And I think if we focus on all of those domains, that's where we really start to be able to build a holistic life and really build a life that's worth living. And that's ultimately, I think, the goal for all of us. Whether you've had mental health challenges or not, whether you've been involved in the healthcare system or not, I think that's really the goal for everyone, is how can we build this life that's worth living? Now, probably from a psychosocial perspective, the area that's been most researched and is most evidence-based is this area of cognition. And I'm hopefully going to show you how we can use cognition to help build up all of those life domains that we're talking about so far. When we think about cognition, there's two big domains you can think of. So you can think about cognitive structures. So these are the things, actually in your brain, different areas of your brain that are responsible for how you process information, for how you think about planning out goal-directed activity, for how you decide whether or not you're going to do something this afternoon or what you're going to have for dinner. That's all what your brain, these different areas of your brain are responsible for, and they interact in very complex ways. The other type of cognition that we often talk about is the content of your thoughts, which is much different than the actual structure of your brain and how it's made up. The content of your thoughts is how you're thinking about yourself in that moment. How do you interpret the world around you? I'm partially colorblind, so when I interpret the world, I interpret it in a very different way than somebody who can actually see full color, and that changes how I make sense of different situations. And so the cognitive content that we have actually changes the way that we interact. If you are someone who hears voices, the content of voices is often linked to the content of things that are going on for us internally. If you're someone who holds some of these unusual beliefs, that's the cognitive content. So if you're worried about, the FBI monitoring you, if you're worried that you've been implanted with a chip, if you're thinking there's a bigger meaning or purpose to the world that you're at the center of, that's the cognitive content that we're talking about. And that interacts with these cognitive structures in terms of how you process information around you. So cognitive content we'll often think about on different levels as well. And in CBT, I'm going to talk about cognitive behavioral therapy in a minute, we'll often talk about these different levels of thought that might come up. And we all have these different types of thoughts that come up. Very surface level thoughts are things like, people are judging me. We probably all get that at times. I get that whenever I give presentations. I'm like, what are people thinking? Are people judging what I'm doing? What am I doing with my hands right now? Those are all natural things that kind of pop through your head. Deeper than those types of thoughts are the rules I live by. And these are often influenced by the previous experiences that we've had in life. And there's big global rules that we often live by, societal rules that we all have to follow to some extent. But we all have our own personal rules that we follow as well. Something like, if I try something new, then I will not enjoy it. Or if I try to do something, I might fail at it. If I make a mistake, then I'm a terrible person. We all have these different rules that we live by, and they're going to govern how we act in different situations. And at the level deepest from that is something that we call core beliefs. And these are very extreme beliefs that we hold about ourselves. They can be positive, they can be negative, they can be neutral, but they can be things, if you hold a core belief like I'm worthless, that's a very, very powerful core belief. That's something very deep. That's something that when it gets activated, it's probably going to influence everything that we do in a situation. And so in CBT, one of the things we do is we focus on these different levels of thought and help think about developing new rules or developing alternative core beliefs. What are some different ways that we can think about the world, think about ourselves, think about the context that we're in that might be more helpful and might help us be a little bit happier or help us do the things that we want to do in our everyday life. And you can imagine how this type of cognition affects really every area of life that we might do. So you can think about the cognitive structures and processes, things like attention and memory. If you're like me at all, you probably lose your keys all the time and forget where they go. That's a memory sort of thing. If you lose your keys all the time, it gets hard to actually go anywhere because you don't have your keys. You go to the grocery store, you've got to scan all these massive aisles nowadays. Cereal is the worst because it's just colorful boxes on end, and how do you ever find your Cheerios in that massive aisle? And if you've got attention difficulties, it's even harder. How do you focus in on that specific thing if you're being distracted by voices, if you're being distracted by other things that are going on in your life? So it becomes even harder to do these types of functional activities. And to make it even worse, if you have the cognitive content that files in on top, if you're at the grocery store and you're not able to focus and find the groceries, and you start beating yourself up and you're like, oh, how can I not even find the Cheerios in this aisle? I'm such an idiot. That makes it even worse. It just compounds on itself. And these are the types of cycles that we try and deal with in both cognitive remediation and CBT. And if we can help with these cycles and help develop more adaptive ways of approaching situations, we can have very far-reaching impact for people with psychosis. And I'm These are all other functional domains that might be affected. But I'm going to show some evidence, hopefully, that actually supports what I'm saying here. So when you think about these two types of cognition, these are the two main areas of treatment that I focus on. Cognitive remediation is really focused on those cognitive structures and building up those areas of the brain to help with attention, memory, problem solving. And CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, is really focused on that cognitive content, helping people work with the content of voices, helping people work with the content of some of these unusual beliefs that might come up, deal with that content like I'm worthless or I can't do this. So let's start with cognitive remediation. Cognitive remediation has a number of different pillars that I would say is probably one of the more fun treatments that we actually do. It works to various degrees for different people. But the first piece of what we do is called cognitive activation. And cognitive activation is playing computerized exercises. They look like games most of the time. Not fun video games, it's not like Xbox, PlayStation quality or anything. Wouldn't even say it's like kind of more modern like apps on your phone, unfortunately. Our stuff is a little bit further behind. But they're kind of fun. It's, maybe more fun than other types of therapy. The goal with these exercises, though, is they're specially designed to target specific cognitive systems. So they specifically help things like attention, memory, and problem solving. And each game targets a different system, and they get harder and harder as you go. And so what we always talk to people about is it's basically like a gym for your brain. And so what our goal is to build up these different areas of your brain, strengthen them, just like you would if you were going to the physical gym and building up your muscles on your body. It takes a lot of work, takes a lot of practice, a lot of energy, but we can get those areas built up so that things like attention, memory, and problem solving are easier. That's not enough, though, in cognitive remediation. So you might hear about cognitive remediation programs that are focused just on these computerized exercises. That's not typically enough to do that. We also really value the therapist component. And so it's important to have a therapist involved too, to help develop new strategies. So one of the things that often happens for all of us is we get used to doing things in exactly the same way. We might, if you walk to work or drive to work, you probably take the exact same way every time you go. If you walk around the block around your house, how often do you take a different route, or do you tend to follow the same one or two or three paths? The more that we do things in the exact same way, the more we build up those areas of the brain. And that's actually not helpful if we're trying to train the brain to do new things, like remember new information and problem solve. So what we want to do in cognitive remediation is try out new ways of doing these computerized exercises. When you're at the grocery store looking for the Cheerios, try out a new strategy for how you find the Cheerios. Do you search one by one along the shelf, or do you look for, what are Cheerios, the yellow, bright yellow box? Do you zone in on that bright yellow box? Try these different strategies out. That's one of the best things we can do for our brain to build new neural connections. And then generalization is the process by which we take what we learn and the new strategies we're doing in these computer exercises and actually apply that in our everyday life. Because it doesn't really help too much if you just practice the computer exercises if it's not actually applicable when you go to the grocery store or when you forget your keys. So we do find that in psychosis, cognition gets very affected after an episode of psychosis. The bottom line there is the baseline average of what happens after psychosis. These cognitive abilities get very challenging. With cognitive remediation, we can boost every cognitive domain up, and enough of them we can actually get back up right into the average typical range as well. And physiologically, we have a lot of evidence for cognitive remediation from fMRI studies, EEG studies, that suggest that we're actually building up those structures in the brain. There's new gray matter that actually is formed. There's new synapses that are formed in the brain, so you're actually building new connections in the brain from doing this. And you get synchronization between areas of the brain that wouldn't normally be seen. And so what's actually happening is you're recruiting new neural resources to help you do these things like attention, memory, problem solving. So we've got some good evidence for the actual mechanism by which this works as well. I want to go through quickly a version of this that we've been testing lately with my research group. So this is one of the cognitive exercises that we might do. See if I can make this work. This is a video. So what you see here, this is the easiest level for this exercise. And with this exercise, what you have to do is you see a file folder on the screen, and you have to classify that into one of the two filing cabinets that's there. And with the filing cabinets, each of those represents a category. You have to decide which of those categories that file folder and the word on it actually gets classified into. That's the easiest level. And so what we do is we start to increase the difficulty as people get good at that level. And we work all the way up to this is the most difficult level. If anyone can actually do this level, I would love to meet you and talk to you because this is an impossible level. When I made this video, I got randomly really lucky, and I think I get like 3 right off the bat. I have never been able to replicate that. This level is impossible, so it's actually impossible to do this level. And we want an impossible level because here what you have now is you have 6 filing cabinets. None of them have a label on it. So you have to figure out what the label is. You have to guess and check what the label is. So as you get one right, you have to say, okay, this might be the overarching category. Next time a shape comes up, maybe I'll put it in that same folder, see if that was right. And somehow you have to remember what the guess is on all 6 of these filing cabinets. And you see it's dropping super fast from the top of the screen. So it's basically impossible. That would help, wouldn't it? Slow it down, have a bit more time, maybe have a notepad and take some notes as you go. But what we really want, we want an impossible level like this because just like lifting weights at the gym, you can keep putting plates on and you can keep lifting more and more weight, basically an infinite amount of weight. What you want to get to is the point where your muscles can't handle it anymore because that's the point where you actually build more muscle. We want these exercises to get to a level where it's impossible because we want people to have the opportunity to go as far as your brain can handle. Once it gets there, we're going to practice that over and over again. We're going to try new strategies, and that's where we get those new synaptic connections. That's where we get those abilities really starting to strengthen. And so like I said, I've never seen anyone get to this. I can't do this. I've sat there and struggled with it for, I think, 20 minutes to try and do it. It's just not a pleasant experience. But the goal is to get people to, level 15, level 20, level 5. Doesn't matter. Wherever the challenge is, that's where the new neural growth comes from. This is the strategy monitoring worksheet that we use. In strategy monitoring, what we're always focused on is what is the strategy that you're using during that computer exercise? How are you doing that? Get people thinking about how am I doing this exercise right now? How could I do it differently if I was to try to do it again? And then let's test out these different strategies and see which one works best. The more we try new and different things, the better it is for our brain. So we first tested this type of training in just 2 weeks. So we had people come in for 3 sessions twice a week. This is an intensive but very brief sort of intervention just to see if we could get an effect for people in a short period of time. And essentially, this is a number of different cognitive domains here. Larger bars are better, so that means more improvement. And we're seeing improvement on almost every cognitive domain that we assessed. For the most part, pretty large improvements too. And remember, this is after only 2 weeks, which is kind of exciting for us. In this study, one of the things I like to do is make sure we have a true control or placebo, because when you research these types of treatments, what happens if you don't have a control group is you see improvements just because people are coming in and doing something different. You don't actually know whether it's the treatment itself or it's just because people are coming in and having some social support that way. So the placebo group got the same type of exercises, except instead of it getting more challenging, people stayed stuck at this level, and all that changed was like the background of the screen or the types of words that came up or what the filing cabinet actually looked like. And so it looked like it was changing and getting harder. And we didn't tell people there was a placebo group or a non-placebo group here. And everyone who got the placebo got the real treatment afterwards too. So everyone thought it was getting harder and changing. So we were able to control for that. But in reality, people didn't have that improvement like you would get at the gym. And so this is not just the general improvement. This is the improvement in reference to that placebo group. So in reference to people who were doing those same exercises, but they just didn't increase in difficulty, which makes it an even more robust finding in a lot of ways. We also assessed EEG. This is a measure of synchronization within the brain. The higher your theta synchronization is, the more you're recruiting areas in the frontal lobes that are involved with memory and planning and problem solving and these higher order, more complex cognitive abilities. So what we actually see with this frontal theta EEG is not just improvement from pre to post treatment, but we were also interested, how does this compare to people who have never had psychosis? And we actually get people back up to the exact same level of theta synchronization in the EEG as people who have never experienced psychosis. So we're getting that neural mechanism. This seems to be working on both the neural level and in terms of how much people can actually use these cognitive skills in different tasks. So then we built this out into a much larger trial, and we compared it to basically the dominant approach to cognitive remediation that was in the literature at this time. This was a more perceptual training approach. So these games look a little bit different. They're not focused on these more complex cognitive skills. What you're going to see here is just lines on the screen that flash very, very quickly. And what you have to do is you have to say, are the lines moving away from each other, or are the lines moving towards each other? And this also might be kind of hard to see. This also, as you go, it gets more and more challenging. It's just targeting different skills. So it's targeting what we would consider to be lower order skills, like how quickly you can do something. But it's not targeting all of these higher order skills, like trying to match words to filing cabinets and thinking about overarching categories and memory. This one gets very fast. So it is challenging on a processing speed level, which is why it tends to work and why it was the dominant approach for a period of time. But we wanted to see, if we compared the approach we were testing to this, how does it do? Which one actually comes out as more effective? So this is, again, pretty brief. This was only 4 weeks. People came in twice a week for this study. So pretty brief to be seeing the types of effects we were hoping for. And we also assessed people 3 months after the end of treatment as well. So this is the same EEG measure. So higher scores on this are meaning you're getting more of that synchronization, you're recruiting more areas of your brain as you're doing these complex tasks. No real improvement in that perceptual training group, but by the time we get to 3 months after people end treatment, there's a huge improvement actually in people who got the executive training. When we think about how people are doing on tests of neurocognition, so tests of attention and memory, again, by that 3-month time point, people have improved pretty significantly on those types of tests. And the really interesting thing, and I think this is the most important part, is not just how do you do on a cognitive test, but what are you doing functionally in your everyday life? And so the functional competence is how well are you able to perform tasks like navigate a map route around the city? How well are you able to give change if you're working as a cashier? How well are you able to have a social interaction and engage interpersonally with somebody? What we're seeing on those tasks, same exact pattern, the executive training group, this new treatment that we were developing, pretty strong effects by the time you get to 3 months after the end of treatment. Same thing, community functioning. This was rated by somebody who knew the person in their everyday life, so either a family member or a mental health case manager. This was not rated by the person in any way. And so in comparison to that perceptual training group, we see, again, pretty significant improvements by the time people get to 3 months after treatment in this third-party rating. So it's not just that the person is performing better in these situations. Everyone in their life is also noticing this change in them. And so that was pretty exciting that we were able to get that after such a short treatment window. Now the challenge, I always get asked this question. I'm going to put a slide up for both cognitive remediation and CBT. The challenge, if you're interested in this type of treatment, is actually finding a therapist who can provide it. And unfortunately, I don't have terribly great news on that front. Cognitive remediation is not terribly accessible We've tried to do a small rollout in the early psychosis network in Ontario. So there are a few early psychosis programs that will offer cognitive remediation. I think my private practice is the only practice that offers cognitive remediation. Our research studies, I always say, are probably the best place to get cognitive remediation right now because you can get it for free. You get, basically the most evidence-based version that we're trying to test out at the current point in time. If you are looking for a cognitive remediation therapist, though, you want to find somebody who does have adequate training, whether it's been on research trials or clinically through a workshop. And you really want to make sure, the biggest thing I always stress with cognitive remediation is you will find the occasional person out there who says they do cognitive remediation, and all they do is set people up with a computer exercise program, something like Lumosity or something equivalent to that. Lumosity has largely been debunked when it comes to mental health treatment, also just for the general population at this point. That sort of treatment is not typically helpful. You want somebody who's going to actually provide that therapeutic intervention as well and help you develop new strategies, help you generalize those strategies to your everyday life. If anybody is interested in cognitive remediation, let me know. I'm very happy to chat about it and think about where you might be able to access that, because there are a few programs, CAMH being one of the ones in Toronto that does offer some cognitive remediation. But there are some other programs in the GTA as well that I might be able to point you towards. But let's talk about CBT. So CBT is where we're really focused on the content of thoughts. And so what's actually going on when it comes to psychosis? Oftentimes with CBT, we're more focused on things like the hallucinations, those unusual beliefs, working with wherever the distress is coming from for people. And I think one of the places where CBT for psychosis differs a little bit from the medical model. The medical model in a lot of ways says if you're having hallucinations or hearing voices, or if you have this belief that we call a delusion, then it means you need treatment. In CBT, we don't actually view that as the case. In CBT, what we think is that it's only worth treating that symptom or that characteristic if it's distressing to you or if it's impairing an area of your life that you want to be doing more in. So if it's getting in the way of something you want to do, or it's distressing, then we want to do something about it. But there's actually lots of people out there who hear voices that aren't distressing. There's lots of people out there who hold beliefs that the rest of society might not hold. You can think about people like who believe that the earth is flat, a lot of the conspiracy theorists and that out there. They're not mainstream beliefs, but it's not psychosis either. So it is possible to hold not mainstream beliefs and not have it be distressing or need treatment. But for everybody I work with and a lot of the people I talk to, there's an aspect of the belief or the unshared experience or something that's going on that is distressing and that is getting in the way of what they want to do in their life. And that's what we want to focus on in treatment. And so CBT for distressing psychosis, I always like to call it, it's a goal-oriented therapy. So it's very collaborative. We're working with people on the goals they want to accomplish. I think oftentimes when people have had negative treatment experiences or negative experiences with the healthcare system, it's because the goals haven't been the thing that the client wants to work on. It's a goal that's kind of imposed by the system or imposed by the program that you're a part of. And oftentimes that's the pure symptom reduction approach. In CBTP, we're really focused on what does the client want? How do we help you achieve that? We base everything we do on a cognitive model. So we spend a lot of time trying to understand situations and experiences through a cognitive lens. We think about coping strategies, and we do a lot of emphasis on behavioral experiments. And really what that is testing out new ways of interacting with the world, new ways of interacting with your experiences, whether it's voices or something else. Oftentimes we'll do different things like actually interact with the voice together, test it out, see how it works. If we have, more of a anxiety or paranoid-based belief there, we might actually test that out and see, why am I anxious in this situation? Is there a different way of interacting in this situation that might be more helpful to me? We do a lot of testing things out, and we do it together. So we do it in session. If we're doing in-person work, I do a lot of virtual work now, but if we're doing in-person work, I'll often go out into the community with people, and we'll test this out together in the community. So it's not just what we do in the therapy room. And with CBT for psychosis, One of the biggest things that we want, the goal is not that it's therapy forever, it's that it's a short-term therapy, and that we're setting people up so that when therapy ends, the improvements that you see at the end of therapy, you can keep those going. And you can keep all of that improvement that you've seen and keep making even more progress. And a lot of the evidence I'm going to show you in a minute does demonstrate that too, that those improvements that you see over the course of treatment, they keep going even once treatment is done. I like to put up the value slide because I think oftentimes these values are things that people have not encountered in the healthcare system. Hopefully you have encountered that. I would say in my experience, it's not always the case in the healthcare system. These are core features of CBT for psychosis. And if you're looking for a therapist who provides CBT for psychosis, and you notice that these values are not being endorsed or these don't seem like core values of what they're doing, I would say that's a pretty big red flag that this person might not be practicing CBT for psychosis in an evidence-based way. We really take a normalizing approach and very humanistic approach to help people meet their goals. The most evidence-based, sometimes I get accused of being maybe too evidence-based, but it's, I don't know, I think it's important because why would we do something if we don't actually have evidence to say it works? But the most evidence-based type of CBT for psychosis is what's called formulation-based CBTP or conceptualization-based CBTP. This is a meta-analysis, this slide, that don't worry, don't squint your eyes and try and figure it out. I'll walk you through it. This is over 30 studies that have tested this specific type of CBT for psychosis out. This is the type that we use in our clinical trials as well. And what this meta-analysis shows essentially is that you get from CBT for psychosis about the same size of effect on average across all of these studies as you get from your average antipsychotic medication. And this is on top of what people already get from their antipsychotic medication. So this is people who still have treatment-resistant symptoms. Most of these studies, people are on medication with treatment-resistant symptoms. And the same amount of improvement that you got from being not on meds to starting to take meds, that's the amount of improvement on average you could expect to get from when you start CBT to when you end CBT. So that's pretty dramatic. And that's not to say that that is equivalent to something like clozapine. Clozapine, I always say, is this medication that stands out from every other antipsychotic and CBT. It's got a much higher effect size, actually. But outside of clozapine, your average antipsychotic effect is the same as what we see on average for CBTP, which I don't think is as well known or talked about out there. Even more interesting based on that. So this was a trial that was done a number of years ago looking at can CBT for psychosis help people who refuse to take medication. So these were people who, for whatever reason, whether it was side effects, moral reasons, whatever it is, didn't want to take medication. And like I showed at the beginning, that unfortunately is, 3/4 of people probably for whatever reason with meds. So these are people who didn't want to take meds, weren't on any antipsychotic medication. Essentially the lower line, this is a symptom measure. So the lower score you have on here, the more effective the treatment is, the reduced symptoms that you actually have. What you see for people who just received treatment as usual, which for the most part was, no medication, maybe a little bit of case management, you see a pretty flat line over the course of those 18 months. For people who received cognitive therapy, you see this pretty steady decline over 18 months. And this was only a 6-month treatment window. So even the year after treatment ended, things continued to improve for people. And these, again, people who decided not to take medication for whatever reason. Building off of that, this was a recent trial done by Tony Morrison in the UK, and he's got another even more recent one that shows the exact same pattern of results. He was interested in directly comparing CBT to antipsychotic medication to a combination of the two. And so this is randomized. This is people who came in with a first episode of psychosis, so who had never been on meds, who had never had any type of treatment really before, and were randomized to receive either CBT, medication, or both. And what you see is that the CBT and medication lines are almost identical. You get the exact same effect, whether people are getting CBT or meds. For people who get both, you tend to get better a little bit faster, but by the time you get to that final period, which is at 52 weeks, everybody's at the exact same spot. which I think is very exciting to say that maybe there is an alternative to medication out there. If you get quality CBT for psychosis, it can have the same effect that medication does. It's not to say, go off medications. It's not to say don't take medications, but there is an alternative out there. And if you take both, potentially that's even more beneficial. The biggest thing with this is we don't know yet who is most likely to benefit from what. There are probably people who are going to get more benefit from medication. There are probably people who are going to get more benefit from CBT. We don't know what predicts that. We don't have any way of determining upfront who might benefit the most from either one. But if one's not working, certainly the other is a very viable option here. When you look at people, this is in the earliest stage of psychosis. So these are people who have some sort of risk factor to develop psychosis and maybe are starting to show the first signs, maybe starting to have some faint hallucinations, maybe starting to have some unusual beliefs show up, but haven't actually had an episode of psychosis yet. CBTP can reduce the likelihood that you go on to have an episode of psychosis by 50%, which I think builds off of what we heard earlier in terms of the importance of early intervention. If we can intervene early, a 50% reduction in that transition is huge. As you get further along in the course of the disorder, and as you get more persistent symptoms that have been there for longer, CBT still works very well. So this was a trial of people who had treatment-resistant symptoms, basically, had tried every medication out there. Some people had tried brain stimulation techniques as well. And what you see, this is a longer treatment window. This treatment window was 9 months instead of 6 months. But what you see is that over the course of time, it's a little bit small up there, but people who got CBTP have that same sort of reduction in symptoms. People in the treatment as usual group still got that reduction in symptoms, but it was more significant in the people who got CBTP. And this is the results from, again, don't worry too much about trying to interpret these graphs, but these are results from a group in Philadelphia with Tim Beck, who first developed cognitive therapy. What they essentially did was go into the state hospitals in Philadelphia. And at this point, this is less than 10 years ago, but at this point, there were still people living in the state hospitals who had lived there for 30 years. And for whatever reason, had either chosen not to leave or hadn't been allowed to leave, unfortunately, in Philadelphia at the time. And so the goal was, can we take people who have really had the most persistent course of illness here and see if CBT works and see if CBT can help people. And these graphs, essentially what they're showing is that on every domain of negative symptoms, so things like motivation, things like independent living skills, we see improvements from CBT. And the level of improvement that we see here, this is a longer term treatment, this is 18 months of treatment, but the level of treatment that we see here is the difference between people living in the hospital for 30 years and now making the decision to say, I don't want to live in the hospital anymore. I want to go out and live in a group home, and actually getting out into the community for the first time in 30 years. It's the difference between people sitting in your room, not doing anything all day for decades, getting out and volunteering, going out to a community center, getting more involved in the community. So it's pretty dramatic improvement. And what we tend to see is for people who have had psychosis for a longer period, you do need this longer course of treatment. So something more like 18 months is going to be more effective. This is a sneak peek slide from our current CBT trial, a slightly different way of looking at it. This measure is a recovery measure. So this is a personal recovery measure of how people are feeling about themselves, their own recovery, how they're doing in life. And this is an average over the course of treatment for everybody who was in this study. And what you see is this upward trend. The highest score you can possibly get on this scale is a 60. And so people are typically starting out at about half of that. And at least at certain points, you start to see people getting up to basically the highest you can score on this. And you get those normal fluctuations across time. So this is session to session over the course of 6 months. Every week we measured this. And so you have weeks where it seems like people are doing really well. You have weeks where things dip back down. But by the end of treatment, people have gone from below a 30 on this scale to like a 50, which is on this scale, it's a huge improvement. That's again, the difference between doing nothing on a daily basis, being so impacted by symptoms that you can't leave the house, to getting out, getting back to school, having those social relationships back, really getting your life back to the place that you want to be. I'm going to skim over this a little bit, essentially to say that basically on every domain of cognitive content that we've looked at with CBT, tends to change over the course of treatment, and that seems to be what drives the symptom improvement and the recovery improvement for people. Now, CBTP is a bit further along in the implementation than cognitive remediation. So we actually have CBTP recommended in all of the treatment guidelines for schizophrenia right now. Started in the UK with NICE guidelines. In Canada, it's recommended in kind of the Canadian treatment guidelines. In Ontario, Health Quality Ontario has recommended CBTP be offered to everybody with schizophrenia, both while inpatient and outpatient in the community. So the recommendation is there. There's efforts, and I've been working over the last year and a half or so to train people at almost every hospital in the province to deliver CBTP. We've had mixed results with that. So there's still not that many people actually trained, unfortunately, but we are working on it. The big issue, and it's something to be aware of if you run across a program and get access to CBTP, is our guidelines right now say that people should be offered a minimum of 16 sessions of CBTP. All of those trials I just showed you, the shortest trial is 26 sessions. And so the guidelines are not actually recommending a sufficient dose of treatment, unfortunately. So it's okay. 16 sessions is better than nothing. But if you ever come across this and you get the opportunity to access CBTP, if you're able to advocate for more than 16 sessions, that's where the evidence is. And I would highly recommend trying to get more than 16 sessions if you possibly can. Unfortunately, like everything with our healthcare system, we go for the shortest, cheapest way of doing it. And so everyone's just offering 16 sessions. But if you're lucky, you might be able to find some flexibility there. Again, finding competent CBTP is also challenging, unfortunately. There's not a lot of people trained. It's kind of a scary number, but there was a recent study that a colleague of mine did in Washington State looking at across North America how many people are actually competently trained to provide CBTP. And the number was there's one competently trained CBTP clinician for every 10,000 people diagnosed with schizophrenia. So that's, I think I could probably treat people for the rest of my life and spend 7 days a week doing it and not get anywhere close to 10,000 people. So it's a huge problem in terms of access. Even more huge, I think, is the issue that because healthcare funding is starting to be funneled in this direction, there's much more interest in organizations being trained in CBTP, and organizations are not necessarily doing the most consistent job in training the quality of therapists that you see in these trials. And the issue is if you get CBTP that isn't quality CBTP, why would we expect that you would get the improvement that you see in a clinical trial if you're getting it from somebody who's not trained in the same way that it was done in a clinical trial? So those CBT values that I put up, that's always a red flag to me. If you see a therapist doing it and it's not that humanistic, normalizing approach, it's not collaborative, if you aren't working on goals that are set with the client, if you aren't going out into the community, if you aren't doing things with your client in everyday life, it's not matching up with how CBT is actually delivered on clinical trials. And not to say that we'll be able to find somebody who can provide CBTP like that, but that's really our gold standard. That's what we want to be going for if you're looking for a CBTP therapist. And I will say, I'll have my email up on the slide at the very end. I'm also happy to give my card out to people. If you're ever looking for CBTP therapists or cognitive remediation, please don't hesitate to get in touch with me because I can at least point you, either our trials are an option or I can point you in the direction of people that I know have been trained or that I've trained in this type of approach that, I have some confidence are actually providing CBTP the way we want to provide it. I'm going to put one plug in for something that we're starting in January. This is a new trial that we're starting. When we think about cognition and we think about these two different domains, the cognitive structures that are actually there in our brain guiding attention, memory, focus, and the cognitive content, the things that we're actually thinking, something we've never tried before is actually combining those, even though it makes perfect sense from a psychosocial perspective. If we can improve both of those, it probably is even more beneficial for people. So can we develop a treatment that combines both of these approaches to really improve functioning, improve that personal recovery, and reduce symptoms? So we've got, starting in January, is a trial looking at this new treatment approach that combines both of those. We're comparing it to both treatments independently. So we're going to see, is the combined better than either delivered independently? It's a Canada-wide study, so we have sites across Canada, all the way out to the West Coast. And it's going to be 6 months of treatment that people get with a 1-year follow-up. So we're going to see if this is any more effective than either provided individually. I'm really hoping it is, because I think it'd be exciting. But again, I'm very evidence-based, so I'm going to hold off recommending this treatment until we actually have evidence for it. But it is a trial that's coming up. And if you're looking for access to any of these treatments, clinical trials I always recommend as a good way to go. Whether that's not necessarily through me, other people do clinical trials too, but clinical trials are a great way to get treatment because you get treatment in the way that it's designed to be done in a gold standard way, and you get treatment from therapists that are actually being supervised as closely as you can possibly be supervised. Because we really want to make sure if you're a therapist on this trial, if you're not actually doing CBT, then you're really messing up our whole research study. So we do a lot of work to make sure our therapists are trained up and supervised very closely. So I always put a plug in for getting involved in clinical trials and research because you get probably the best type of psychotherapy you can, and it's free. You just have to be okay with doing some assessment and research procedures as well. So I'm going to end there. I always like to end on this note, but I think it really embodies a lot of our values with CBTP, a lot of our values with cognitive interventions in general for psychosis, but really from the perspective that psychosis is always understandable. I think we get this perspective out there in society that there's something that's not understandable about psychosis, or psychosis is somehow fundamentally different from people who don't have psychosis. That's not true. There's no evidence for that. Again, I'm on my evidence front. The evidence doesn't support that. The evidence supports that psychosis is just one end of the continuum of normal human experience. Psychosis is treatable, whether it's medication, whether it's brain stimulation, or psychotherapy that I probably have a bias for. It is treatable. Recovery is possible. And these experiences, are a normal part of human experience. We just want to help people cope with that experience and understand why it's happening and get people back to the life that you want to be living. And on that note, I'll end, and very happy to take any questions from everyone. So the question was, I've been doing some training, and I've been doing training across Ontario to try and get CBTP out there more accessible, but I mentioned that I've had mixed results with it over the last year and a half. It's a very good question to wonder what that means. Not to throw organizations under the bus, but we have had two main challenges. At the hospital organization level, I would say half of the hospitals that we've been trying to train have not been supportive of staff time to deliver CBTP. So even though people are being trained, they actually don't have time in their jobs to provide CBTP, which is a big problem. The second problem we have had is that this has been, the last year and a half with the pandemic, there's been a huge amount of burnout among mental health clinicians. And so we've had probably 40% of our training cohort that have changed positions or maybe are no longer in a position at the same hospital anymore. And so that's really disrupted the training as well. So we're working on it, but it certainly has not been the expansive, training that we were really hoping it would be. That being said, the people that have completed the training are wonderful therapists. I'm very excited for them to be able to start doing this in their practice. The question was about brain stimulation and my thoughts on that. I don't do brain stimulation, so I'll keep this short. Essentially, it works for some people. And, especially for treatment-resistant symptoms when other things haven't worked, things like ECT, or TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation, can have results on symptoms or cognitive abilities. So it can be something that's worth trying. Electroconvulsive therapy gets a bad rap because of, one flew over the cuckoo's nest. I wouldn't necessarily say that that's the place to start. Something like ECT can be life-changing, especially if, symptoms haven't responded to medications or other types of treatment approaches. The one other thing I will mention is we're doing a trial right now at Ontario Shores in Whitby, where we're looking at combining a type of transcranial magnetic stimulation that specifically targets that theta frequency I was showing on those graphs. The goal of that is to stimulate that frequency in the brain while people are doing cognitive remediation. And so you can actually stimulate that while people are engaged in therapy. Again, I'm evidence-based and we don't have results yet, so I have no idea if it's going to be more helpful or not, but we're seeing if, while doing that stimulation and the treatment at the same time, if it has better effects. Yeah, so the question is around all the guesswork that goes into basically all of our treatments, and would it be better to get a brain scan that could actually help inform the treatment in some way? The short answer is that brain scans are not as accurate or precise as we would like them to be. And the things that we tend to be looking for in the brain are not consistent across everybody who has psychosis or bipolar disorder. There are some new approaches that are hopefully helping with that. But at this point, we actually don't have, and this is a huge thing in the research field right now. It's a big discussion going on. There's all this, not to be pessimistic, but basically research coming out that we don't have any good evidence for neural indicators right now for any disorder, including things like depression and anxiety. Nothing that's actually useful from a precision medicine approach like that, where you can actually personalize it according to the brain scan, which is really disappointing. I'm really hopeful that that changes, but it's disappointing at this point that we don't have anything yet, especially after decades of doing it. And the UK is far ahead of us in a lot of ways, unfortunately. I mean, at least they're ahead of, at least they're doing exciting things, but they are ahead of us in that way. One thing we're trying to do with this TMS cognitive remediation study is we are assessing EEG first. So we're actually trying to see from the EEG where is the synchronization happening and can we target the TMS to that. Again, I have no idea if that's going to work, but CAMH is also doing a lot of this type of work to try and target brain stimulation according to brain scans in that. But again, it's very early days. So yeah, so is the question, does this type of therapy affect the amygdala? Both of these therapies actually affect the amygdala, which is a surprise to me when I always come across this when it comes to cognitive remediation. Cognitive behavioral therapy makes a lot of sense. Cognitive remediation also affects the amygdala and actually downregulates the amygdala. One of the ways it does that, especially the executive type form that I was talking about, is the amygdala is connected to your frontal lobes, and it's regulated in a lot of way by your frontal lobes. And so we can directly downregulate the amygdala. We can also downregulate the amygdala by improving the functioning of those frontal lobes and that connection back to the amygdala. So cognitive remediation tends to do that, and then we also have evidence from CBT that the amygdala becomes less reactive in stressful situations after CBT. So typically what you would see is, this big spike in activation when people are exposed to social stressors is how we typically look at it. That gets reduced after cognitive behavioral therapy, so there's not as strong a reaction. Yeah, so the question is how can as members of the general public, how can you or how can anyone make a difference in making this more accessible? I really wish I had a good answer for that. We need, healthcare policy that's really guided towards, emphasizing this type of treatment. A lot of times, healthcare policy is still guided very much towards the medical model and not as much towards a psychotherapeutic approach. That might be changing right now. But anything we can do in terms of raising awareness about this, writing your local politician, Minister of Health, I think the more we can advocate, the more hope we have. The other thing that I've been trying to do, I don't know if anyone has any connections to help make this happen, but I've been trying to look for funding sources outside of, the public health system. Sometimes, there's different banks and different insurance companies and that will fund training. I'm really trying to look for other sources that will actually fund training for clinicians, because that's the biggest thing we need now is we need more clinicians who are actually trained. And until organizations are willing to fund that, if there's other bodies that are able to fund that, I always think insurance companies should be very interested in this because the economic impact is huge. It's expensive to train therapists to do something like CBT for psychosis. It's very intensive. If you think about a therapist working one-on-one with somebody for 6 months or more, it's very expensive. Very expensive to train somebody because it takes a couple of years to train somebody up to a quality standard. Even despite all of that cost, you still end up saving about $1,000 a year in healthcare cost per patient, which is a huge amount of money when you expand that out over any number of years. And on top of that, that's including all of the initial training costs. So once you have your workforce trained, the amount of money that's saved increases dramatically beyond that. $1,000 per patient per year doesn't sound like a lot until you start thinking about the hundreds of thousands of people who actually have psychosis. And then all of a sudden we save the healthcare system a lot of money. It is a great question. So to what extent are psychiatrists buying in and using this type of approach? I would say it's mixed. It really depends on the psychiatrist. I would say psychiatrists tend to buy in a lot to cognitive remediation because medications do very little to help attention, memory, and those types of cognitive skills, whereas cognitive remediation is about the only thing we have that helps that for people. It's a lot more mixed when it comes to CBTP. I would say in Ontario right now, there's a shift happening where psychiatry is very interested in CBTP. In fact, in this training cohort that I've had recently, there's a number of psychiatrists who have done this and psychiatrists who are actually making time in their clinical practice. It's always amazing to me because you think of psychiatrists and you think of a 10-minute medication consult, basically. These psychiatrists hugely value psychotherapy and have made the time to actually start to integrate, doing hour-long psychotherapy sessions into their clinical practice. And there's not a lot of them, but there is a movement towards that. And so there's some really amazing psychiatrists out there starting to do this. Well, thank you, everyone. I really appreciate everyone being here and all the questions. I'll be around for a bit after if anyone else has questions or wants to talk.
I'd like to really thank you for coming and sharing your time and your expertise. And this is a small token from Home on the Hill.
Wonderful. Oh, thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you.